Thank you. I should mention to everybody how much effort Imran has put into not only this event, but other projects relating to oppressed communities internationally under MPAC, along with his team. We also have Afreen with us, which I'm pleased to see. She's been a campaigner in one of the most repressive regimes, and I can only appreciate the kind of work that she's done for her community. But she's also, if not many people know, she's also a person that has evolved thoughts and opinions and comments on the Kashmir struggle beyond the traditional Indian rhetoric. And of course, CJ's contribution has been invaluable to so many communities. I wouldn't know where to begin and end in appreciating him. I would add, though, that some time back he interviewed my wife, so it really is a privilege that today I get to share a platform with him. Now, I start by stating clearly that I am a Kashmiri, so most of what I'll be speaking about will be in context of Kashmir. That said, I won't go into the history of occupation, repression, oppression, and subjugation of India on Kashmiris, but we'll focus on the who, the how, and the why. Now, when we talk about India's illegal occupation of Kashmir, we have to understand that this doesn't vary from one political party to another. There's a general consensus in India that Kashmir is their integral part. Some may question the human rights violations and others will pursue CBMs, but ultimately, they all agree that the people of Kashmir and the territory belong to India. That said, opinions on Kashmir have recently evolved, which I'll come to later. I don't differentiate between political parties in India when it comes to Kashmir specifically, and as an outsider, I would offer the opinion that minorities, which basically means anyone who isn't an upper caste Hindu, probably feel the same way. Various parties are open and transparent in their agenda, while the rest are wolves in sheep's clothing. In context of Kashmir, I'll give the most recent example of the BJP revoking Article 370 and 35A and bifurcating Jammu and Kashmir, turning it from a de facto occupation to a de jure occupation, breaking international laws and UN resolutions along the way. I mention this because the Congress party jumped on the bandwagon and emphasized that the BJP were only able to do so as the Congress party had spent years slowly diluting Kashmir themselves. They were fighting to take credit for an illegal and undemocratic action. And when they're not fighting for credit, they certainly don't condemn actions that would benefit the Indian political agenda of either party. Take the example of Amnesty International. When a huge international NGO is told to pack up and leave and never return, essentially being banned, then what kind of India are we looking at? The blame may lay with the BJP, but where was the outcry from other political parties and their supporters? Now, before going into the political philosophy and ideology of the Indian state, I personally believe that the older generation of Indians have started questioning the rhetoric and waking up to what Kashmiris have endured, and what we have been warning Indian minorities of what would be coming their way. I hate to use the term, but the newer and younger generation are more woke. And although I can't say that they all unconditionally support Kashmir's right to self-determination, they certainly are not guilted into uber nationalism nor blind and tolerant to their own conditions. Now, although rhetoric still sells in India and many still fall for false promises and propaganda, there is a shift in thought, not necessarily attributed to Kashmir and probably not from the old guard, but from the increasing realization from a generation more educated, with more exposure and more connected, that whatever has happened and is happening is not normal. And because of that comprehension, the institutional policies on Kashmir have begun to be questioned, from basic human rights to the question of India's so-called sovereignty over Kashmir, but only after facing the beginnings of open assaults on themselves. Case in point, the CAA and NRC bills, a textbook tactic of fascists, notably Adolf Hitler, who did exactly the same thing 85 years ago. But here's the thing. Although the fascism of Nazi Germany may have been defeated in 1945, Hindutva fascism was founded in 1925, and a cursory glance at the links between the fascism of Hitler and Mussolini with the RSS is blatant and undeniable, but we'll come back to that. The CAA and NRC bills affect poor Muslims more than anyone, and it's the poor who are overwhelmingly without paperwork to prove that their grandparents are citizens. Everyone else except Muslims can use the loophole of non-Muslim refugees in Afghanistan and Bangladesh, and Muslims will be shunted into detention camps or exile, or even worse. And when talking about the CAA and NRC bills, I would go so far as to say that the root cause of the discriminatory bills is the revocation of Article 370 and 35A. Let me explain. It's unquestionable that the CAA and NRC are discriminatory and exclusionist for both Muslims and minorities in India. But I must emphasize that this is irrelevant to Kashmir. As a Kashmiri, I can state with authority, don't identify nor are we by any stretch of the imagination Indians. However, Kashmir has always been India's laboratory, where they've experimented with various versions of oppression and subjugation whilst continuing their illegal occupation. It's never mattered which political party was in power. The Indian states have always maintained a singular policy on Kashmir, which by now should be obvious and apparent. But there is more to India's policy. Using Kashmir as a testing ground for more than 70 years, the Indian government finally exported its trials to mainland India in the shape of the CAA and NRC. And although the CAA bill was passed in 2019, the principle itself predates the birth of India. And those principles manifested in Kashmir over 7 decades on an extreme scale, leading to war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and demographic change. Recently, a report was published that India have already issued 400,000 domicile certificates to non-Kashmiris, so they may permanently reside in Kashmir. The demographic change, ethnic cleansing, and settler colonial project is in full swing, so much so that it took Israel 50 years to do what India have done in less than a month. I want to mention that the passing reference to Israel is deliberate, because there are many comparisons that could be made, as well as conversations about the relationship between India and Israel. But I am conscious of time in today's theme. I would add, though, that the influence of India on UK politics is still in its infancy, but we've seen how effective they can be, particularly since the BJP came into power. And if we don't act preemptively now, we'll end up with a lobby as powerful as the infamous Israeli lobby in the US. Which brings me to the current BJP government, headed by Narendra Modi, backed by the RSS, a parent organization of the BJP, a radical, neo-colonial, right-wing fascist group that have an expansionist program and aspire to create a pan-Hindu nation under one party, as they believe they are a superior race. Now, if that sounds familiar, that's because it is. Not just familiar, but identical to the ideals of Nazi Germany. Identical to the extent that the RSS's literature is inspired by Hitler and Nazism and even pays homage to them. The RSS uniform is inspired by them. The RSS salute is inspired by them. And the RSS vision too is inspired by them. Their expansionist vision, called Akhand Bharat, goes as far as the Middle East, to the extent that they claim the holy Kaaba in Mecca as their temple, referring to it as Mekeshwar Mahadev temple. What can you expect from people that call the Taj Mahal as Tejo Mahalaya temple, Qutub Minar as Vishnu Stam temple, and of course the controversial and now demolished Babri Masjid as Ram Janam Bhoomi temple? Now, also known as the Ram Mandir, by the way. On a side note, I want to mention that the foundation laying of Ram Mandir happened on the 5th of August 2020, exactly a year after India illegally annexed occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The symbolism is apparent, and it was purposefully done. There is no coincidence. First, they abolished the Kashmiri identity, and then they laid the foundations of the Hindu identity over the ashes of the Muslim identity by destroying the masjid. And it's not just the identity of those they consider lesser mortals that they want to diminish, but eliminate anyone that does not bow down to them, submit, or convert. We've seen numerous mob lynchings all over India, the threats of digging up dead Muslim women and raping them, concentration camps in Assam, and of course, cold-blooded murder. I remember the case of Tabriz Alam in India, where the 11 accused had tied him up, beat him mercilessly, and filmed it while forcing him to say Jai Shri Ram and Jai Hanuman. He was married for 6 weeks before he was attacked and died of his injuries. Another Indian Muslim called Afrazul was hacked to death, chopped to pieces by Shambhulal Regar while live streaming it all. What's worse is that he was later bailed by the BJP to campaign for their re-election. Now, although these are examples of Muslims, other minorities face persecution and brutalities as well, even those who are Hindus. They just happen to be a lower caste, which for some reason renders them as obscene as Muslims. Which leads me to the fact that there are terrorist training camps running all over India, and not just for adults. They train them young. They instill this sick ideology and mentality in them early, which can only be described as brainwashing, because I cannot believe that the human race, even Hindus, are born with such thoughts. Yet in Kashmir, we have seen things that cannot be described as human rights violations, because that term does no justice to what the people have gone through. And as I've mentioned before, the terms we use are war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and now sponsored by the BJP and RSS, a settler colonial project to force demographic change. But this isn't new. As I've already stated before, Kashmir has been used as a testing ground by India for decades, and that laboratory experiment has now expanded as a policy into mainland India. And this is where Kashmiri Muslims' frustrations come to boil, because we have been warning Indian Muslims as well as minorities for years, and they watched what happened to Kashmiris, yet they remained silent. Now, the arguments that minorities in India, including Muslims, had to be careful for their survival is a weak argument, if not a false argument. Because the people of Kashmir, for more than 70 years, stood firm in the face of oppression, subjugation, and occupation, despite the crushing force of the Indian army, the draconian measures of successive governments, and little to no international coverage. There's a modern saying that everything is made in China, but courage is made in Palestine. That same courage resides in every Kashmiri, proof of which is in the blood we have spilled defending ourselves and protesting for other nations and peoples brutalized, even being killed for it. And you see anti-fascists and anti-imperialists stand for Palestinians, support the Uyghurs, condemn the atrocities in Syria. Yet for some reason, Kashmir has been a stumbling block for the majority, and they mostly turn a blind eye. Now, here's the irony. Despite the lack of historic or present support from the Indian minorities, we still unconditionally stand in solidarity with them against the barbarity that they face. The reason I use the term unconditionally is because those who lend their support, no matter how big or small, mostly tend to come with terms and conditions. They may condemn the human rights violations, yet usually maintain the rhetoric that Kashmir is an integral part of India, which goes against the UN resolutions. And here I have to clarify that the protests we had seen in India post-CAA and NRC where slogans of Azadi or freedom reverberated throughout the country were slogans of Azadi within India. They still believe in their constitution, in their nationalism, and in their identity as Indians, which they are absolutely entitled to. Whereas Kashmiri's call for Azadi is completely and utterly different. We want Azadi from India, not within India. Ultimately, what I'm saying is that despite the disappointment, we sympathize, empathize, and stand in solidarity with Muslims of India, including other minorities. But I want to remind them, they had seen a lengthy preview for 70 years of what was to come. However, I want to emphasize that despite criticism, we recognize the apparent beginnings of a shift away from the structural beliefs in India, which I referred to from the very start, proof of which are conscientious individuals. Cynics will always accuse those who stand in solidarity with Kashmir as anarchists, anti-nationals, anti-Indians, or simply using Kashmir to further a sponsored agenda. But I put it to you as an optimist, that those who have started to support Kashmir's right to self-determination acknowledge that it really is a right, and that their own liberation from the shackles of fascism and saving India from fascists is intertwined with showing solidarity with Kashmir. There is a difference between the current and previous generations of Indians who see Kashmir beyond the context of forced blind nationalism or just human rights. It is a challenging notion, but accepting Kashmir's right to self-determination, which could lead to freedom from the Indian Dominion, and being a true Indian patriot are not mutually exclusive. Recognizing truths, especially about the faults of one's own government, is not treasonous, nor is critiquing one's own community for their apathy or bigotry towards another community. It takes remarkable courage to stand for justice, and even more so to stand for Kashmir in the current climate of India. But the current climate that Indians face at the hands of the BJP is a consequence of what every Indian government did in Kashmir. India have time and again broken international law, UN resolutions, and the Geneva Convention. And in fact, Genocide Watch issued an alert on Kashmir on the 15th of August 2019 last year. Remember that in October-November of 1947, nearly 250,000 Kashmiris were massacred and tens of thousands forced to migrate, as reported by a London newspaper. I mention this because recently Genocide Watch stated that preparation for genocide is definitely underway in India. What can you expect from a nation whose army chief laments that protesters use stones instead of guns, as it would then be easier to justify killing children? Or of the army major who screams on an Indian news channel to continue using rape as a weapon of war in Kashmir? Or of the political leaders directing their supporters to dig up the graves of Muslim women and rape them? Or of a terror accused being supported and winning a parliamentary seat? Khushwant Singh, in his book, The End of India, wrote, "Far from being Mahan or great, India is going to the dogs. And unless a miracle saves us, the country will break up, and it will not be Pakistan or any other foreign power that will destroy us. India will commit suicide," or harakiri in Japanese. I understand there is short time, and I'll conclude in a couple of minutes. In 1990, the RSS had over 1 million members, who included, among others, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, L.K. Advani, Murli Manohar Joshi, and Uma Bharti. Now, the last three names mentioned were charged with the destruction of the Babri Masjid on the 6th of December 1992. And of course, we know that Narendra Modi presided over the program in Gujarat. The RSS was and is anti-Muslim, anti-Christian, and anti-left. It could be dismissed as a lunatic group as long as it remained on the fringes of mainstream politics, but not anymore. Its political offshoot, the BJP, had only 2 MPs in the Lok Sabha in 1984 and 117 in 1991. And now this party rules the country. I should point out that there are many other Hindu organizations out there that are more militant than the BJP, such as the Shiv Sena, Bajrang Dal, and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, to name a few. In conclusion, the CAA, NRC, and any other laws prior to them or those that will come after are inevitable. We know the game plan. It's not like the BJP and RSS have hidden it in the shadows for no one to see. In fact, they proudly flaunt their agenda and win elections on the back of potentially draconian and illegal acts. But that doesn't mean that other parties are lesser sinners. Ask any Kashmiri. And yet we mostly see indifference towards Kashmir from the world community and not enough action to end Hindutva terror. I end with a reminder. It's not too late. India have crossed the line and have gone so far beyond it that they've set a new benchmark of criminality and turned their own voters into fanatics. Remember that Germany was a literate nation and yet succumbed to the most irrational sort of racial prejudice. As Khushwant Singh said, India is largely illiterate, and it's much easier to sway the masses by rousing their basest instincts. When the Holocaust happened, the world said never again. When the Rwandan genocide happened, the world said never again. When the people of Srebrenica were ethnically cleansed, the world said never again. The days of colonialism, imperialism, and fascism should be over. Until and unless India is de-radicalized, we will continue to witness a rise in extremism and terrorism. And I hope that we can work together to force the world community to intervene and stop the further annihilation of Kashmir, Kashmiris, and minorities in India by the hands of radicals under the terrorism of Modi, the BJP, and the RSS, or even other political parties masquerading as sympathizers and saviors by pretending to be protagonists of a liberal and inclusive India. Thank you very much.